What happens when a firebrand preacher publicly smashes a sacred icon with a sledgehammer, only to later beg that same icon for mercy as he lays dying? This isn't fiction. It's the true story of a man who waged war on faith, only to find salvation in the very thing he rejected. In the heart of rural Indiana, in a small town called Redwood Creek, where classic diners sit next to storefront churches and centuries-old Catholic missions, two spiritual worlds quietly collided. One rooted in centuries of tradition and the tender image of the Black Madonna, the other born of powerful sermons, bold faith, and a fierce rejection of all icons. Reverend John Carter stood at the center of that collision. At 54, with piercing gray eyes, a mane of thinning red hair, and a voice that could crack a preacher's pulpit, John had become a household name in evangelical circles. His sermons were streamed across half the state, his words a hammer. Miriam cannot save you. The saints cannot hear you. Only Jesus. He led the Gospel Hall, a thriving evangelical congregation that had outgrown 2 buildings in 5 years. To his followers, many working-class Anglo and converted Latinos, he was a prophet. To the local Catholic community, however, he was something closer to a tornado across a quiet town. Sister Elena Morales, a lifelong member of St. Jude's Catholic parish, had watched it happen in slow motion. It wasn't just theology, she once whispered to a reporter. It was our history, our soul. He called our grandmothers idolaters for lighting a candle to the Black Madonna. Indeed, the Black Madonna of Our Lady of Sorrows was not just a religious figure to these families. She was Abuelita's quiet strength, the statue on the porch during a thunderstorm, the reason some women walk barefoot during December processions through the cold streets. And for John Carter, she was a symbol of superstition too dangerous to ignore. So each year on the Feast of Our Lady of Sorrows, when thousands gathered to celebrate the patroness of the Americas, John and his flock would line the route holding signs that read, "Idols can't hear you," and "Worship Christ, not statues." They prayed aloud in English while the Catholic hymns floated through the Indiana dusk in Spanish, but it wasn't until December 2013 when it all came to a head. As the sun set on a reverent procession, an elderly woman named Doña Consuelo, a great-grandmother, walked barefoot, clutching a small framed image of the Black Madonna. Her lips trembled as she whispered prayers for her sick grandson. She passed by John, standing at the edge of the route, Bible in one hand, megaphone in the other. Then it happened. In front of a stunned crowd, John took a bold step forward, raised a sledgehammer, and smashed a small statue of the Black Madonna that stood on a public pedestal, yelling, "She doesn't exist. You're bowing to superstition." A gasp swept through the street. Phones shot up to capture the moment. Doña Consuelo simply knelt and whispered, "Forgive him, little mother. He doesn't know what he's doing." That moment, the smashing, the scream, the prayer, would become the clip that shook the internet. By morning, it had gone viral. To outsiders, it was just another controversy. To Redwood Creek, it was war. John claimed it was prophetic conviction. The Catholics called it sacrilege. News vans parked outside both churches. The mayor issued a plea for unity. Faith lines, once blurred by shared family ties, and neighborly potlucks hardened like steel. But deep inside one hospital room just months later, that same preacher, the one who had hurled a stone at the Queen of Heaven, would find himself whispering her name in pain, desperate not for a miracle, but for peace. And that's where this story truly begins. Long before Reverend John Carter became the face of anti-Catholic rhetoric in Indiana, he was just little Johnny, a quiet boy growing up in a modest duplex on Ash Street, 2 blocks from St. Jude's Catholic parish. His mother, Dolores Diaz, was a second-generation Mexican-American who clung tightly to her rosary beads and faith. Every night, without fail, she would light a candle in front of a small, framed print of the Black Madonna above the fireplace. "La Madrecita always listens," she'd whispered to John before bed, even when no one else does. John believed her. As a boy, he prayed earnestly for good grades, for his dad to stop drinking, for the arguing in the house to stop, and most of all, for his mother's health to improve. Dolores had been sick for years, with what the doctors called an undiagnosed autoimmune condition. It left her tired, in pain, and eventually bedridden. But she kept praying. Every morning, despite the weakness in her limbs, she would reach for that rosary and murmur, "Ave Marias," through cracked lips. John was 13 the night she died. The candle had burned low. The house was silent except for the beep of her heart monitor, and when it flatlined, John fell to his knees in front of the image of the Black Madonna and waited for something, a miracle, a sign, anything. Nothing came. No whisper, no warmth, no movement in the candlelight, only silence. At the funeral, he refused to speak. At the burial, he refused to pray. "Where was she when Mom needed her?" he muttered when no one was listening. "Where was God?" Over the next few years, something hardened inside him. He still went to Mass, out of obligation to his grandmother, Abuela Sofia, who had taken him in. But his heart was no longer there. He watched with growing resentment as she kissed her medallion of the Black Madonna, as she whispered novenas into the morning light. He started skipping church, first once a month, then completely. Then came the flyer. It was left tucked into the screen door one humid afternoon when he was 17. A bold title in crimson ink, "Christ Saves Alone." He tossed it in the trash and then pulled it back out. That night, for the first time, he read the Bible without Catholic eyes. He lingered on the words in the Gospel of John, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." That was the spark. What followed was a wildfire. By 23, John had joined a small non-denominational Bible church on the outskirts of town. Within months, he was preaching youth sermons. By 28, he had started New Hope Fellowship out of a borrowed mechanic's garage. His sermons weren't just about salvation, they were about purification. He saw his calling as cleansing the community from what he now believed was idolatry, disguised as tradition. But the most defining act of his early ministry came one Sunday afternoon. He was 29. Abuela had invited him for lunch after Mass. She was frail but cheerful, setting out tortillas and tamales like it was Christmas. After the meal, she returned to her altar, the same one that had once belonged to Dolores. John stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her kneel. Then something snapped. He walked in, grabbed the framed image of the Black Madonna, and without a word, hurled it into the backyard where it shattered against the fence. His grandmother screamed. "It's just glass and paper," he yelled. "God doesn't live in icons." Abuela Sofia didn't reply. She just closed her eyes, whispered a prayer, and never spoke to him again. She died 2 years later. He didn't attend the funeral. Years passed. The altar was gone. The Black Madonna was gone. Only the anger remained, justified, baptized in Scripture, and polished for public display. But for those who knew John before the pulpit, especially Sister Elena, who taught him catechism, they remembered a boy who once believed in miracles. "He used to cry during the Christmas Mass," she once said. "Something broke inside him after his mother died, and instead of healing, he built a ministry out of the pieces." By 2010, the name Reverend John Carter had become more than a local preacher. It had become a brand. What started as a group of 12 believers crammed into a cluttered auto garage on the south side of Redwood Creek had exploded into a fully functioning congregation known as the Gospel Hall. It was housed in a repurposed warehouse with a glowing neon sign that read simply, "Christ saves, Miriam doesn't." To his critics, it was offensive. To his followers, it was truth finally spoken aloud. Sundays became events, rows of plastic chairs filled with former Catholics, born-again believers, recovering addicts, single mothers, and teenage runaways. They came not just to hear about grace, but to hear war declared on everything that had once confused or wounded them. John stood on the stage, not behind a pulpit, but a steel platform in rolled-up sleeves and work boots. His Bible was worn, but his voice was sharp. His tone wasn't tender, it was tactical. Statues don't bleed for you. Rosaries don't redeem you. Saints don't hear you. Only Christ, only the cross. And then came the fire sermons. He began targeting one symbol more than any other, the Black Madonna of Our Lady of Sorrows. To John, she wasn't just a false idol. She was a cultural stronghold, a spiritual virus, as he called it, that had wrapped itself around generations of Latino families, holding them hostage to superstition. He devoted entire sermon series to dismantling Marian theology. Slides, quotes, historical deconstruction. Every Sunday was another strike against the Queen of Heaven. Miriam was blessed. Yes, he shouted once in a sermon that later circulated online. But she's not your mediator. She's not your mother. She's not divine. And she is not listening. The church grew. The message spread. One of his earliest converts, Isabella Sanchez, remembered the moment she left the Catholic Church. Her husband had been an alcoholic for nearly a decade. She had prayed novenas to the Black Madonna for years. "Nothing changed," she said during a testimony night. "But the moment I gave my life to Christ alone, no statues, no saints, he got clean. It wasn't the Black Madonna, it was Jesus." Stories like Isabella's were John's fuel. They became part of a larger narrative. The Black Madonna is holding you back. Christ sets you free. But not everyone was converted. In fact, the Catholic community grew more alarmed by the month. Across town, Father Mark Garcia at St. Jude's Parish watched it unfold with weary eyes. "He's not just attacking doctrine," he once told a diocesan reporter. "He's attacking our families, our traditions, our mothers." The tension, once subtle, began to stretch into the streets. During the feast of Our Lady of Sorrows, Redwood Creek's Latino neighborhoods would erupt in celebration. Marching bands, candle-lit processions, barefoot pilgrims, girls in white dresses walking with framed images of the Black Madonna held high. And in the shadow of those traditions stood John Carter. He began organizing what he called freedom marches, countermarches during Catholic feast days. His congregation would dress in plain clothes, carrying signs that read, "The Black Madonna can't hear you. No queen in heaven but Christ the King. Don't kneel to images. Stand in truth." They weren't violent, they didn't yell, but their presence was disruptive, intentional, designed to challenge, not just to witness. And then came December 12th, 2013, a day that would change everything. The Guadalupana procession that year was the largest Redwood Creek had seen in over a decade. Streets were closed. Police escorted the faithful as they moved through the city, chanting hymns and lighting candles. An 80-year-old woman named Doña Consuelo, barefoot, carried a small image of the Black Madonna against her chest. Her grandson had been diagnosed with a serious illness. She whispered to the Black Madonna with each step, "Bring him peace. Little mother, just peace." That's when she saw them. A group of nearly 50 members of the Gospel Hall stood along the sidewalk. John was at the center, Bible clutched in one hand. He looked tired, but electric. As Consuelo passed, he stepped forward and raised his voice, not in a scream, but loud enough for hundreds to hear. That virgin won't save your grandson. She doesn't exist. Then he did something no one expected. He swung a small sledgehammer at a plaster statue of the Black Madonna on a nearby pedestal. The crack of the shattering plaster was explosive. Gasps, tears, phones raised to record. Someone shouted, "Blasphemy!" Another yelled, "Call the police!" But Doña Consuelo said nothing. She simply knelt right there on the pavement and whispered, "Forgive him, Holy Mother. He doesn't know what he's doing." Within hours, the video was online. Within days, it had over 4 million views. To some, it was proof of prophetic boldness. To others, a vile act of religious hatred. Even many Protestant leaders across the state distanced themselves from the act. But for John, it was a holy stand. "He was just being honest," said Mark Evans, a deacon in the church. "Truth offends, and Jesus said it would." But what no one, not even John, knew at the time was that the moment he smashed that statue would become the first step on a road that would break his body and remake his soul. 6 months after the infamous December procession, the smashed statue, the scandal, the viral storm, Reverend John Carter stood once again before his congregation, but something was off. The fire in his voice flickered. He stumbled on a Bible verse he'd quoted 100 times before. His hand trembled as he turned the page. For a moment, he seemed lost. Then he blinked, chuckled softly, and pushed through. Most assumed it was exhaustion. After all, the church had doubled in size since the video went viral. New locations were opening across Indiana. Pastors from other states were calling him the Martin Luther of modern Reformation. But at home, his wife Maria saw what others didn't. The headaches, the long silences, the sudden flashes of anger over minor things. Once he forgot the name of a deacon he'd worked with for over a decade. Another time, she found him standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at the wall, holding a spoon like it was a microphone. "I'm just tired," he kept saying. "It's spiritual warfare, nothing more." But then came the Sunday when his body gave out. He was mid-sermon, walking the edge of the stage when he gripped his chest and collapsed right in front of 600 people. A gasp moved through the church like a wave. Screams, rushing feet. Someone called 911. Others knelt in prayer. Maria ran to the pulpit as her husband lay motionless, his lips twitching, his eyes wide and unfocused. At the general hospital, scans were taken, blood was drawn, and 3 days of silence followed. On the 4th day, Dr. Henry Collins, a cardiologist with 30 years of experience, entered the room holding a clipboard and wearing a face that had delivered bad news before. "Mr. Carter," he began carefully, "you've suffered a massive myocardial infarction. Your heart is severely damaged." John didn't flinch. He just stared, eyes unreadable. Maria gasped. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "It means he may never be able to leave the hospital. With this level of damage, we can manage it for a time, but I need to be honest. This is a life-threatening event." Silence. A heavy, sacred silence. Later that night, while the city buzzed with its usual chaos, inside a dim hospital room, a man who had spent 2 decades declaring that Jesus heals all who believe, stared into the ceiling tiles and felt abandoned. "Why now?" he whispered. He had preached revival in dozens of churches, rebuked idolatry in city streets, cast out addiction in families. He had stood firm when others called him a fanatic. He had smashed a statue of the Black Madonna and proclaimed Christ without apology. So why now, when the ministry was thriving, when hundreds hung on his every word? Was his body crumbling? That night when Maria returned from the chapel, she found him weeping, not from pain, but from confusion. "I've spent my life yelling for God, and now he won't answer." She held his hand, unsure whether to offer scripture or silence. "Maybe," she finally said, "this isn't punishment. Maybe it's a door." "A door to what?" he muttered. "To see what happens when you stop shouting and start listening." At church, the news spread fast. Prayer chains lit up. Fasting began. Pastors across Indiana called for 24-hour intercession. On live streams, Maria asked for healing miracles. She quoted James 5:15, and the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. But John said nothing. He smiled politely during visits, nodded through prayers. But at night, when the machines beeped and morphine dulled the fire in his skull, he wasn't praying for healing. He was praying for answers. And so, the man who once shouted at statues began whispering in the dark, not for a cure, but for a God who might still be listening. The hospital lights never truly went out. Even at 3 a.m., they hummed faintly through the blinds, casting a sterile glow over Reverend John Carter's gaunt, sweat-soaked face. The morphine dulled the pain, but not the questions. And it was in those long, merciless nights when the prayers had stopped coming from his lips and started echoing only in his mind that the ghost began to return. Not demons, memories. The image that haunted him most wasn't the smashed statue of the Black Madonna, but his grandmother Sophia kneeling at her makeshift altar, whispering Ave Marias with a peace that now felt unreachable. He had hated that peace once. He had torn her Black Madonna from the wall and shattered it on the concrete. He'd called her foolish, blind, lost. And now he lay in a hospital bed, whispering to a God he could no longer feel. Maria noticed the change first, not in his body that had already been breaking, but in his tone. He wasn't angry anymore, she later recalled, just hollow, like all the fire had turned to smoke. One night, while spooning ice chips into his mouth he could barely swallow, she asked gently, "What are you thinking about?" John stared out the window. The city beyond was quiet. "Do you remember," he rasped, "when I smashed Abuela's altar?" Maria hesitated. "I do." "I said it was just clay and paint," he whispered, "but she cried like I'd broken a piece of her soul." Silence. "And maybe I did." That confession cracked something deeper than any sermon he had ever preached. Over the next few days, John spoke less about miracles and more about regrets. He remembered Teresa Alva, the Catholic mother whose son, Joaquin, he turned against her. He remembered Isabella, the woman who had denounced the Black Madonna with such passion because he had taught her to. He remembered the day he used a hammer to destroy that statue and told her God wasn't listening. What if he had been wrong? What if the people he dismissed as idolaters had simply found God through a different window? That thought shook him more than the pain in his chest. Because if that were true, if the Black Madonna was not an enemy, but a mother to the broken, then he had spent his life declaring war on love itself. Nurse Angela Collins, who had worked in hospice for over a decade, noticed how patients nearing death often spoke in loops. The same faces, the same phrases over and over. But John Carter didn't loop. He unraveled. One morning, as she changed his IV bag, she heard him whisper something that stopped her cold. "Little mother, did you ever pray for me?" Angela, a devout Catholic herself, stood still. She didn't speak. She just watched as a man who once claimed the Black Madonna was nothing more than a myth wept silently into his pillow. His congregation didn't know. They still gathered in rotation, praying loudly in the hospital chapel, declaring healing, fasting for breakthrough. They wanted the John Carter who cast out demons, who stood at pulpits and pointed fingers. But that man was gone. In his place was a dying preacher staring into his own legacy like a courtroom transcript. "I taught people to hate," he told Maria one night, "and I wrapped it in scripture." She didn't argue. She didn't say he hadn't. She simply held his hand and whispered, "Maybe now you get to teach them something else." The heart was not healing. The scans confirmed it. But something else was growing too. A question not about God's existence, but about his voice, and whether it sometimes came through people we were too proud to listen to. For John Carter, the firebrand who once screamed that the Black Madonna was a lie, the real torment wasn't the pain in his heart, but the possibility that the woman he'd hated most had been quietly loving him all along, and maybe, just maybe, she still was. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Joaquin Alva knocked on the hospital room door. The halls had been quiet, eerily so. Nurses moved like ghosts. Machines beeped in dull rhythm. Outside, a pale Indiana sun poured through tinted glass. Inside, Reverend John Carter lay sunk into white sheets, thinner now, smaller than his reputation. Maria opened the door. The man standing there was in his late 20s, his brown hands folded around a small plastic rosary. He wore a simple plaid shirt and held a familiar object in the crook of his arm, a framed image of the Black Madonna, slightly faded at the edges. "My name is Joaquin," he said softly. "I'd like to see the pastor." Maria hesitated. She knew who this was. Joaquin Alva, the man who had once been a follower of her husband before returning to his faith. The man whose mother had been heartbroken by John's teachings. The man whose name had come up in John's bedside confessions more than once. Still, Maria stepped aside. John's eyes fluttered open as Joaquin entered. He blinked twice, his vision blurred, but he knew him. It had been years, yet he remembered his face. Not from a peaceful conversation, but from a single moment across a picket line, his hand clutching his mother's wrist, pulling her away from a protest where John had denounced the Black Madonna. Now he was standing at the foot of his bed. "Joaquin," he rasped. Joaquin didn't let him finish. "I'm not here for apologies, Pastor," he said gently. "I'm here because I heard you were ill. And I wanted you to know. My mother and I have been praying for you." The room held its breath. John blinked again. "Why?" he whispered. "After everything, after what I taught you to do, why would you pray for me?" Joaquin stepped closer and placed the small image on his bedside table. Then he sat. "Because," he said, "you are still someone's father and someone's husband, and someone who once believed he was doing the right thing. And because my mother taught me that a person of faith never stops hoping you will come home." John's lips quivered. He turned his face away. "I destroyed your peace." "No," Joaquin said firmly. "You didn't. You tried. But peace rooted in love survives even the loudest hatred." He looked at the image now beside him, her eyes downcast, hands folded, cloak of stars. "I taught hundreds to mock that face," he whispered. Joaquin reached over and gently placed his palm on the back of his hand. "And I forgive you." There were no trumpets, no dramatic music, only the hum of the oxygen machine and the soft murmur of passing nurses. But something cracked in that room. A wall that had been built from years of pride, sermons, theology, and fear, finally buckled under the simple weight of mercy. Maria wept quietly in the corner. Before he left, Joaquin stood and turned to him one last time. "I didn't bring the Black Madonna to convert you, Pastor. I brought her so that if you feel alone, you'd remember that she is still here, always praying, even when her children forget how to pray for themselves." Then he smiled, a real smile, not out of victory, but out of peace. and walked out of the room, leaving the scent of roses and candles behind her. That night, John didn't cry out to heaven. He didn't beg for healing. Instead, he whispered 2 words into the silence. "Thank you." No one knew whether it was to Joaquin or the Black Madonna or maybe even to God himself. But for the first time in months, he slept without pain. Something shifted after the visit. Joaquin Alva's quiet presence had left more than a framed image on the bedside table. It left a silence, not the kind that isolates, but the kind that softens. For days, Reverend John Carter said little. He didn't ask for the latest lab results. He didn't request more medication. Instead, he asked for a notebook. Maria brought him one, leather-bound with a ballpoint pen tucked inside the spine. "What's it for?" she asked. John looked at her, his voice thin but steady. "For things I should have said years ago." And so, with trembling hands and a morphine haze clouding the edges of his thoughts, he began to write. The first letter was to Joaquin Alva. "Joaquin, I once told you that loving Christ meant destroying what your mother cherished. I called it courage. I see now it was pride. A real man doesn't have to choose between faith and family. I made you believe you did. For that, I beg your forgiveness." He folded the note, handed it to Maria. "Make sure it gets to him." The second was to his congregation. That one took longer. He stared at the blank page for over an hour, as if the very weight of leadership, 20 years of sermons, baptisms, conversions, pressed down on the paper. Finally he began, "To my brothers and sisters in Christ, I once taught you that purity of doctrine required the rejection of others. I mistook zeal for truth. In trying to defend Christ, I forgot how he loved. If I ever made you feel that hating Catholics was faithfulness, I was wrong completely. Christ doesn't need us to divide. He died to unite." He signed it simply, "Pastor John, a sinner saved by grace." Maria posted it to the church bulletin. By sunset, it had been shared 8,000 times. Some followers were shocked, some were angry. Others, like Isabella Sanchez, wept. "He's still my pastor," she told the local paper, "but now he's also my brother." The last letter was the hardest. It wasn't addressed to the living. "Abuela Sofia, they say the dead don't read letters. But if your soul is anywhere near heaven, maybe you'll hear this. I broke your altar. I mocked your prayers. I thought your faith was weakness. But you had something I lost trying to be right all the time. Peace." The ink smudged where the pen paused. "If you ever see the lady in blue stars, the one you whispered to through tears, tell her that the boy who smashed a statue of her finally understands what it means to be held by grace." Maria placed that letter in the small wooden Bible box they kept at home, the one Sophia had once used for prayer cards. Word of John's letters spread far beyond Redwood Creek. A local Catholic radio host read them aloud on air. A pastor from a nearby city reached out to share them with his congregation. Even Father Mark Garcia, the longtime Catholic priest John had once publicly debated, called Maria with a request. "May I visit him?" When he arrived, the 2 men, once rivals in theology, spoke not as opponents, but as 2 weary travelers, both scarred by years of spiritual warfare. "I was too proud to listen," John admitted. "I was too quick to judge," Father Garcia replied. Before he left, the priest took John's hand. "Pastor," he said, "maybe God didn't allow this heart attack to punish you, but to let the walls fall down." John smiled through pale lips. "Then let's not rebuild them." In the weeks that followed, the notebook remained beside him, filling slowly with thoughts, names, prayers. He didn't call them confessions. He called them repairs. And one by one, bridges that had once been burned were quietly rebuilt, not with sermons, but with humility, ink, and the simple phrase he had rarely used from the pulpit. I was wrong. No one expected the video to go viral. It was recorded on a Tuesday afternoon in a quiet hospital room. A nurse named Angela Collins set up the tripod. Maria pressed record. On the edge of the frame stood Father Mark Garcia, dressed simply in a black shirt and collar, and lying in the bed, surrounded by IV lines and the constant hum of monitors, was Reverend John Carter, barely a shadow of the man he once was. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. To the members of the Gospel Hall, and to the faithful of St. Jude's Catholic Parish, for years I preached division in the name of truth. I see now I mistook zeal for conviction, and in doing so, I hurt good people, faithful people, people who loved God in a way different from me. I was wrong. Father Garcia then stepped forward. As a Catholic priest, I too carried resentment. I allowed anger to cloud compassion. We both believed we were defending God when in fact we were defending ourselves. The two men looked at one another, not with rivalry, but with the quiet recognition of shared wounds. Today, John said, we lay down our swords, not because doctrine doesn't matter, but because love matters more. And if Christ prayed that we be one, who are we to pray for anything less? They ended the message in prayer together, not as Protestant and Catholic, but as sons of the same Father. The video was posted to both churches' social media pages that evening. By midnight, it had been shared over 100,000 times. By the end of the week, national religious outlets had picked it up. A pastor's dying wish, unity, headlined one article. Two faiths, one forgiveness, read another. But the real transformation didn't happen online. It happened in Redwood Creek. The following Sunday, something extraordinary occurred at St. Jude's Parish during the 10 a.m. Mass. A group of visitors quietly entered through the side doors. Men in jeans and women in plain skirts, some clutching Bibles, others carrying nothing but uncertain smiles. They were members of the Gospel Hall. At the same moment, across town, a group of elderly Catholic women in lace veils walked into the back pews of the Gospel Hall's warehouse church. No one said anything at first. Then someone stood up and crossed the aisle. A young man named Joaquin Alva, once a poster child for John's evangelical fire, now trembling in front of his childhood parish priest. "I want to ask forgiveness," he said, voice shaking. "To my mother, to my neighbors, to the Black Madonna, whom I judged without knowing her story." From the other side of the room, Doña Consuelo stepped forward, eyes wet with tears. "I never stopped praying for you, mijo," she whispered, "even when you hated what I loved." They embraced, and in that simple moment, walls crumbled. For weeks, both congregations continued crossing thresholds they never thought they would. Joint food drives, prayer walks, vigils for the sick. Children from both churches played together in the same dusty parks where once their parents avoided eye contact. Even the mayor of Redwood Creek issued a statement calling it an unprecedented example of spiritual reconciliation in modern America. What no one could deny was this: it started with a man who had once used a sledgehammer on a sacred image and ended with him kneeling beside it. At his funeral, held in the high school auditorium, neutral ground, there were no banners, no denominational flags, just a simple wooden cross, and beneath it a table. On that table, a worn Bible, a rosary, and a letter with a handwritten title, "Things I Got Wrong and What They Taught Me." The auditorium was filled to capacity. Protestants and Catholics sang together, cried together, prayed together, and as the final hymn rang out, "Amazing Grace," sung in both English and Spanish, no one asked who believed what. They only asked, How can we keep this going? It was November, Dia de los Muertos, when Reverend John Carter woke just before dawn. The hospital room was silent, save for the soft beep of the heart monitor and the distant echo of church bells ringing across Redwood Creek. Outside, marigolds lined the sidewalks. Inside, his breath came slowly, measured, fragile, but his eyes were clear. Maria sat beside him, dozing in the chair with her Bible open on her lap. When he stirred, she woke instantly. "John," she whispered, taking his hand. "I'm still here." He smiled faintly, but not for long. There was no fear in his voice, no trembling, only peace. For the first time in months, the pain had lifted, not because of the morphine, but because something in his soul had quieted. The war he had waged for decades had ended, and this time he had surrendered. At 6:30 a.m., Father Mark arrived. He had come each morning since the reconciliation video, sometimes just to sit, sometimes to pray. But this morning felt different. Maria opened the door and simply nodded. Inside, John looked up and offered a weak grin. "You came?" he rasped. "I told you I'd be here at the finish line." Father Mark took a seat beside the bed. They didn't speak for several minutes. They didn't need to. Then John turned slightly toward the small framed image of the Black Madonna still resting on his nightstand. Worn, faded, the same one Joaquin Alva had left behind. "I used to call her a myth," he whispered. Mark said nothing. "But I think," John continued, eyes moist, "I think she prayed for me anyway." He turned his gaze to the ceiling. A shaft of sunlight streamed through the half-open blinds and lit his face with a soft golden hue. "Do you believe," he asked, barely audible now, "that a mother ever stops praying for her children?" "No," Father Mark answered gently. "Not even once." John nodded. His lips moved slow and careful. "Little mother, take me to your son." Those were the last words he ever spoke. He died at 6:47 a.m., just as the sun rose over the rooftops and the Catholic bells met the soft strains of gospel hymns drifting from New Hope Fellowship across town. The timing was unplanned, the harmony undeniable. The funeral took place 4 days later in the Redwood Creek High School auditorium, a space big enough for what had become a citywide act of healing. There was no pulpit, only a wooden platform, no denominational emblems, only two objects side by side, a Bible cracked at the spine and a rosary gently coiled beside it. The service was led jointly by Father Mark and Pastor Elena Vargas, John's longtime associate minister. They spoke not of doctrine, but of redemption, not of victory, but of peace. Isabella Sanchez sang a Marian hymn in Spanish. Then a young Catholic choir followed with Amazing Grace. The auditorium filled with both laughter and tears. But the moment that no one forgot happened just after the final blessing. Joaquin Alva, standing beside his mother, stepped forward and held up a letter. "It's the one Pastor Carter wrote me," he said. "The one where he said, 'Loving Christ never meant hurting the people who love you.'" Then he turned to his mother and whispered, "Gracias por no rendirte." "Thank you for not giving up on me." She took his hand, and together they laid the letter beneath the cross at the front of the stage. Later that night, as candles were lit across altars and driveways for Dia de los Muertos, someone placed a single white rose beneath the statue of the Black Madonna outside St. Jude's Parish. Taped beside it was a torn piece of notebook paper. It read, "I spent years shouting to God through a megaphone, but in the end, I only heard him when I listened through a mother's prayer. John Carter." In life, he was known as the man who used a hammer on the Black Madonna. In death, he became the man who finally understood her silence, and in that silence, found peace. Months passed. The hospital bed was gone. The flowers had withered. But the story, his story, refused to fade. In Redwood Creek, something had taken root that couldn't be explained by theology or tradition, something that neither seminary nor sanctuary had ever quite achieved. A softening. Two churches, once defined by tension, now held monthly joint vigils. Children who had once been told they're not like us now prayed hand in hand. The local food bank overflowed each weekend with volunteers wearing both crucifixes and Jesus Saves shirts. It wasn't perfect. Old wounds take time. But the dividing line had been blurred by something no debate could destroy: compassion. In a back office at the Gospel Hall, tucked between sermon archives and boxes of outdated flyers, a leather-bound notebook sat on display. The one Reverend John Carter had filled in his final weeks. Visitors still came to see it. They didn't always cry. Sometimes they smiled, especially at the last page. If I had to preach one last sermon, it wouldn't be about the Black Madonna or theology or getting the gospel perfectly right. It would be about sitting across from someone you once called wrong and listening anyway. Because in the end, it wasn't doctrine that saved me. It was mercy. No name, just a shaky signature at the bottom. Teresa Alva now led a small interfaith prayer circle out of her living room each Wednesday. One night, when asked why she kept attending even with Protestants, she simply said, "Because John taught me something no priest ever did." "What's that?" a young woman asked. "That sometimes," she smiled, "the greatest act of faith is forgiving someone who thinks you're lost." Father Mark Garcia continued serving at St. Jude's Parish, but his sermons had changed. Less fire, more grace. He still quoted scripture, but now he paired it with questions like, "Have you listened to someone who believes differently than you?" without planning your rebuttal. And at the end of each Mass, just before the final blessing, he would often say, "Let's not just be right, let's be kind." Even the younger generation felt it. Joaquin Alva, once a fiery street preacher, now studied pastoral counseling at a seminary in a nearby city. "I used to think truth was something you shouted," he told his classmates. "But Pastor Carter showed me it's also something you whisper into someone's suffering." He keeps the letter John wrote him folded inside his Bible. It's yellowing now, but the words haven't lost power. And somewhere in a quiet cemetery on the edge of town, beneath a modest headstone that reads simply, "John Carter, 1960 to 2014. Grace found me when pride let go." There's a statue nearby, not of Christ, as many might expect, but of the Black Madonna. Simple, peaceful, no inscription, just her hands folded in prayer. And every now and then, someone places a single white rose at her feet. No one knows who, but many believe it's someone who once stood on the other side of belief and finally crossed over to understanding. What John left behind wasn't a church movement or a theology trend. It was something quieter, something stronger, a truth older than division and bigger than doctrine. That love, real, sacrificial, patient love, heals more than any argument ever could. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shows up with a rosary in one hand and a Bible in the other and says, "Let's walk together." If this story touched you, if you believe like John came to believe that love is stronger than what separates us, subscribe to our channel for more stories of redemption, healing, and unexpected grace. Because sometimes the most powerful sermons are lived, not preached. Subscribe, share, and never underestimate what mercy can restore.